Welcome to week 2 of a little series on what I'm calling the American Jesus. And why am I doing this? That's a good question. Um, in part because most of my life, when I was when I used to talk a bit about Jesus, like when I was a pastor or a high school teacher, there were certain rules that had to be followed. I had to play by those particular rules, and in some ways, the constraints were itself rewarding, but also limiting. And I thought maybe since I quit being a pastor and moved outside of institutional Christianity, that would be kind of it. Then all of a sudden, I thought, well, maybe it's time to talk about Jesus again. So on the one hand, it's a bit personal. On the other hand, something very strange is going on in our culture, and has been for a long time. And that is what I'm calling the American Jesus. I noticed, I don't know if you watched the National Football Championship, Georgia and Alabama, or was that? Okay. I saw that they sang the national anthem and Trump was up there. You've heard of Trump? He's okay. And he was there on the field, and then they finished the national anthem, and the players all ran out onto the field, and then they all knelt down and prayed, you know. I mean, not like as a unit, but individually. And I thought, this is interesting. What's going on with this mixture of symbols? So it's a question I have. In other words, I don't think we can totally ignore Jesus, even if Jesus is not really your thing, and I understand. And actually, mere mention of Jesus, and I want to just acknowledge this, for some of you, you have a lot of religious, you have a major religious hangover. So mere mention of him is like, I don't know if I just want to say I understand. But I still think maybe it's worth wading into it. So I'm trying to do it with a sense of openness, like I have something here to learn, and there's something worth probing around in. I'm not exactly sure what it is, but I announced I was going to do a series, so I'm going to do it. The other actually comes from Jung, and I mentioned this last week. I'm just reviewing a few things. It was just one line. Jung says, religious symbols, even powerful religious symbols, ones that can last hundreds, if not thousands of years, can run out of steam. And when they run out of steam, they lose their power to transform. And I wonder, is that what's happening with American Christianity or with Christianity more broadly? You remember Spong's famous book, Christianity Must Change or Die. Well, those are two choices. A lot has changed in recent years, even through the work of people like Spong, but also a lot is dying. And it's almost dying right in front of us. And maybe there's something to the symbolism that's also dying. Particularly the American Jesus, the atonement American Jesus, where, you know, you might as well imagine him on a cross with an American flag draped over it at this point. So what I'm saying is that, what I'm suggesting is that image is losing its power to transform. In fact, it's doing the opposite. It's keeping us locked in a kind of tribal, ethnocentric, us versus them mentality, like in Dylan's song, With God on Our Side. So we just make Jesus like us, and then we're back into this us versus them thing, which doesn't seem to be at the heart of the person of Jesus. So I wonder if sometimes, this is kind of an odd comparison, but I wonder if sometimes Jesus is not a little like statues of Robert E. Lee that stand in the middle of a square somewhere that represent a nostalgic time that never really existed in the first place. So I'm just saying, don't tell anybody I said that. I also, Facebook Live, yeah, of course. Oops. It's a problem with the social media stuff. You say it and you can't take it back, you know? And I also mentioned 4 Jesuses last week, by way of review: the American Jesus, the Jesus of church history, the historical Jesus, which I was totally committed to for like 10 years of my life, and then what I was calling the mystical, cosmic, Christ consciousness that seems to be down in there somewhere, which is why I wanted to put in a quotation from Ken Wilber this week. Because that esoteric dimension that most people don't realize, he's saying, is down there somewhere. And I'm just curious, is that down there somewhere? Is there something transcendent, that's even trans-religious for that matter, down there in the bottom that can be brought up into the light of day? For what purpose? Well, that's the question. I mean, my way of putting it would be the purpose of transformation. So it's at least worth asking that question. So that's what we'll try to do. And while we're on the subject of Ken Wilber, I love Ken Wilber, and I always admit I hardly know what he's talking about. But Ken Wilber also says something I think that's kind of profound. He says 90% of religion, the symbols, ideas, images, groups, 90% of religion keeps people stuck in egocentric and ethnocentric ways of being. 90%. And you nod your head because you think, yeah, that's probably true. He also says 10%, for 10% of the people, it can lead to some real transformation. It's his way of saying it's kind of rare. So that's just worth, I guess, wondering about, is that true? And when you look at the way Jesus is used in our culture, it doesn't seem like there's a whole lot of deep transformation. Even into things that Jesus seems to be about, like nonviolence, compassion, understanding, non-judgment, which I'll talk a bit about today. We tend to think about Jesus, even if you don't even like Jesus, you kind of think he was a little like that. But his followers don't seem to be very much like that. So what's happening? Is it dying? That's a sort of a question behind the question. Now, I'm still working on my introduction, by the way. One more thing. I think right now, for some reason, maybe every age feels like this when you're in it, but right now the 21st century feels very potent. It feels pregnant, like something else wants to be born. Or as the Greeks would, the Greeks love the word apocalypso, which means the death and renewal of something at the same time. That's what it feels like we're in. Something is being burned up, and maybe something is also being born at the same time. But it tends to be an age where we're pulled toward two extremes, which I mentioned before in previous talks. What I was calling nihilism or narcissism. Sometimes great anxiety can pull us in those directions. Narcissism is exactly what it sounds like. And we have major cultural figures who are embodying that. Wink, wink. But we get pulled in that direction, especially in terms of anxiety, or the opposite, which is nihilism. None of this matters. There is no meaning. I might as well watch the college football championship and numb out, you know. And I don't want to live like that. And I don't think you want to live like that. And every time, almost every week when I come here, I like to look at the values on the back of the C3 thing here. Because it's a reminder to not go to sleep in the age of narcissism and nihilism. I heard a scholar say this week, I can't remember her name, her last name was Wheatley, I just can't think of her first name right now. Margaret, yeah, thank you. She said that some of the problems right now is that when you start talking about truth, and you have things like alternative facts, and you have things like news, and then you have fake news, pretty quickly, people start to think and feel that nothing is true. And that's a black hole. Now, I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that feeling. I feel that way, and especially I'm like a Gen X, postmodern, all truth is relative kind of person. But that's a black hole. Really, nothing is true. Nothing. Except when something is said that is blatantly false, you get kind of fired up, correct? So we want to try to chart a course out of that, I think. Out of that resignation. Because there are things that are true, and even if we're not the sole possessors of truth, they're worth pursuing. What is real? What is real? What is really going on in our culture? What is really going on in our world? What's true? What's true? And it's not, you cannot find it with a Google search. It requires much more of a holistic step toward a a pursuit like that. So that's the age we're living in. And what I'm just asking in a general sense are, is there something of the Christ consciousness, the mystical Christ, the esoteric Christ, that is one of the many pointers back toward what's true, what's real, what's good? That's what we're kind of exploring. Does that make sense to you? So what I want to talk about is judgment and karma. Now, Jesus doesn't really use the word karma, and I had to admit, and we have a little pre-gathering before the gathering, and I also had to admit, I'm not sure what I mean by karma. I don't really mean it in the popular sense of the word. There's something rich about it, and I'll get to exploring that for a moment. But let's start with a story. Let's start with an old Hindu story. So there was a poor farmer, and once a week, sometimes once a month, he would come into town with his pound of rice. And he would bring it into the village, and he would see the big village shop owner, who's kind of the big man in town. And that's where he would sell his rice. And what he wanted was really more of an exchange than just money. Because being a poor farmer, he couldn't grow something his family loved very much, which was sugar. So he would come into town from time to time with his goods, pound of rice, and he would sell it. And in exchange, he would take home a pound of sugar. This went on for years. And one day, the big man, the boss man, the shop owner, started to get suspicious. He started to think, I don't know if I really trust this poor farmer. And anyway, he probably comes from sort of a shithole part of the country, And he said, that's so much funnier this week than it would have been last week. Yeah, so he starts to get suspicious. And then one day, sure enough, the poor farmer comes with this pound of rice, and he takes the pound of rice and sets it on the scale. Sure enough, it's short. He says, I knew it. I knew I could not trust you. My gut told me you could not be trusted. And all this time you've been cheating me. For years you've been cheating me. You owe me so much rice at this point in time. The poor farmer is kind of devastated. He says, sure you're right. I'm so poor that I don't even have weights at home to weigh my rice. I try my best, but I don't own any weights, so I simply take the pound of sugar that you've been selling me and I put it on my scale. Yeah, see? That's a story of karma. And actually, there are two parallel tracks in this story that are worth exposing. The first is, what you put out there in the world, you're bound to receive back. So if you put out in the world a little bit of cheating, or negativity, or anger, or suspicion, you're bound to receive that back in some way. And you could take God out of the equation. I'm not saying, there's like a master puppeteer up there pulling strings. I just mean when you put that energy out in the world, it tends to come back to you in some way. The other track in this story has to do with judgment. Because the big boss man, farmer man, is filled with judgments. But what can he not see? He can't see his own cheating ways, correct? Otherwise, it'd be so obvious. He'd be like, oh, it's possible he has forgotten all about the fact that he has been cheating people for years. You don't see what you don't see, correct? And sometimes it first comes out that you see it in other people before you see it in yourself. That's like shadow work 101. Or projection 101. I need to put it on somebody else for a while until I can see that it's also true in me. So what is the invitation in this story? And of course, what does this have to do with Jesus? Well, it turns out Jesus has some very similar ideas and teachings along these lines. I'll give you a line. By the measure you use, it will be measured against you. That's saying virtually the same thing. And I love the measurements too, because that's actually what's happening in this Hindu story. They're measuring, they're weighing, and how you measure things, that will be measured back to you in some way. Which the invitation, the first invitation, has much more to do with the individual than the other. How am I measuring the world? How am I sizing things up? What is my behavior like in the world? That's the first invitation around these kinds of things. Let me say one other thing that I think is worth noting. Last week, I was trying to talk about blindness, and I was saying potentially what I would call spiritual blindness is a major, I guess it's in just about every religious or spiritual tradition that I know, some form of spiritual blindness. It's, by the way, what the Buddha would call ignorance. I was saying in sort of the Jesus model, it's maybe called more blindness, but virtually the same thing, ignorance and blindness. And when you come out of ignorance or blindness, the question is, what's next? And Buddhism is very straightforward. What's next is right action. You have to act differently in the world. It's not just a matter of, if I could just clean up the way I see things, then I could just see things clearly. I can see clearly now. And I just chill on the beach because my vision is so great. No, it's to lead to right action. But the problem is, when you can't see, you always act in unhealthy and unhelpful ways in the world. So I just want to mention that because we live in a very privatized society, and I am 100% guilty about this. We even think about spirituality as being my private affair, correct? But although there is always an individual component to it, a healthy spirituality seems to be about how you then go live out there in the world. Which is why our values, if you read them very carefully, they're really about how to live in the world. That's what we're probing. How to live in the world. Not just how to think in the world. That's one of the major problems with religion and American Christianity. I got all these beliefs, and if I just line them all up and check them off on a box, I can just feel good about myself, I guess. And it's not working. And everybody knows it's not working. And the millennials know it's not working because they're like, we're not going. So, in any case, let's go a little further with some of these lines of teaching with Jesus. So, right before he says, by the measure you use, it shall be measured against you, Jesus says very directly, do not judge. Do not judge. Now, let's, first of all, some honesty about this. That's a judgment. Right? Who are you to tell me not to judge? You're judging me for judging. So it can get into the kind of this weird, cycle, a weird vortex that you can't quite get out of. What do we think Jesus is talking about? Do not judge. Maybe it means something like, do not be judgmental. Because on the one hand, making judgments about the world is part of the human experience. And some of it is instinctual. We were talking about this in the talk before the talk. That even those instincts, fight or flight, or freeze, or mate, the other, never mind. I don't want to go too far with the alliteration. But those instincts that come up, that we make quick judgment about the world, some of those are biological. And I don't think we can educate those out of us, nor should we. They're instincts, and a lot of them are rooted in egocentric ways of being and sometimes ethnocentric, but nevertheless, they're there. The question is, what do you do with them? What do you do with those impulses that you have when you're suddenly around somebody that makes you a bit uncomfortable, that's not in your socioeconomic class? Or you go on a cruise and you're at the port and you say, you know what, I want the real thing. I'm going to go into town. Then you go into town and you're like, I don't know if I really want to be in town, And suddenly you feel out of place. So what do you do with those moments, those instincts? What kinds of conclusions do you begin to draw from those things. And what does Jesus, or the Buddha for that matter, what are they trying to get at when they say do not judge or do not be judgmental? Maybe, and this is maybe just a suggestion I might have I think maybe one way of looking at a line like do not judge really means do not label. Do not label. Now, I like labels. And on the one hand, labels, they form a kind of statistical frame. This person is doing this. They're a part of this political party. They vote like this. It gives us sort of a statistical frame in which to locate someone. But how many people do you really know that fit into a single category? I mean, really. One time, I met a group of playwrights from Princeton, and they were just graduate school playwrights. And they were going around the country interviewing people that fit very neatly into certain categories. Religious categories primarily was the intention of this play. And they just kept asking them question after question after question after question after question. And that was going to be the play, their responses. And every single person pretty much started off the same way, where right at the beginning you're like, oh, this person is start filling in the blank. They're a Republican or they're a Democrat and they're a Protestant. And then all of a sudden those start breaking down. The human being on the level of the soul is a mystery. Would you agree? I mean, really, deep down, the deep self is a mystery. Doesn't fit into any particular label or category. So maybe on the one hand, it's an invitation to view the world with a little resistance toward labels, or what I would call the dualistic mind, which loves either or categories. And that's what's so sick and sad about our political culture. We're given two choices. Well, the Green Party we can throw in too, but two. And the culture is saying, pick one. Is it not? Pick one. And we all kind of feel uncomfortable with that kind of dualism. You say, it doesn't not really, but what are you going to do? When I was in Israel, American politics is confusing. Israeli politics, there are 32 political parties. But you can find one that's a little closer to home base in a situation like that. But here we're just given these binary categories. And maybe on the one hand, Buddha and Jesus are saying, don't label. Don't label people on the level of the soul. Maybe. The other, I think, line that's perhaps worth pointing out, or image, is pretty famous, but it's a pretty good one. Jesus says this, why do you worry about the speck of dust in someone's eye? Why do you worry about the speck of dust in your brother's eye? Why do you worry about a speck of dust in your sister's eye? Meanwhile, you have a plank in your own eye. Now, just tell me you've been there in your life at one point. You've been spending your time worrying about dust particles in someone else's eyesight, and meanwhile you have some kind of large log in your own. Yeah. See, this doesn't matter what you believe about Jesus or doctrines or even Christianity. There seems to be something, if it's true, it's true. And this seems to be true about the human experience, I think, in the esoteric, trans-religious sense of the word. So, do we leave it at that? Jesus says, okay, no. Be careful or carefully remove the plank or log or beam or stick out of your own eye. Why? So you can see clearly to remove the speck of dust from your brother's eye. Do you see how that's about right action? Which changes a discussion about being non-judgmental. Because I do not think this teaching is hinting at there's no such thing as truth. Because that's one way of approaching non-judgment. Who am I to say? You can have your truth. I can have my truth. It's okay for you to believe. And we've been trying that for a while. It's okay for you to believe, as long as it doesn't harm anybody, which is a judgment. But you have your truth. And you need to speak your truth, and I'll speak my particular truth. Except right now, culturally, in America, we're experiencing the limits of such an idea. We are. And it's breaking down. It's not working. So the invitation in this sense is to take a look at how you see things. So the first invitation is, how do I do it? How do I look at the world? What are my judgments and biases and stereotypes? How do I see things? And how is that blinding me? And if I begin the process of beginning to clean out my own vision, then I actually can see clearly to say, that speck of dust in your eye, let me help you out there. In other words, there are things that need to be called out in our world. There are. And the people who are most equipped are the ones who are, I guess in contemporary language, doing our own work. Admitting our own limited vision, admitting our mistakes, in other words, walking through life a little more humbly. Like the people on Twitter are walking through the world with such humility. I think, honestly, I'm not saying social media has no place, but I'm saying on the level of the spirit and spiritual growth, if you want to use that word, or maybe just growing up in general, I think we're being asked to take a different path. Jesus, I think, is pointing that way in this particular instance, but so are many other teachers. And our world is sick. When I think about what is C3, it's a kind of experiment. Like, it's a kind of a wild, uncharted experiment. By the way, one of the things, I didn't know that much about C3's history, but one of the things that inspired me to think about applying for the job here was the story of Christ's community taking the cross down. I thought, wow, you're not messing around at that point, I mean, if you stop saying the atonement is the very center of our religious identity, we're not going to preach that unworthiness game anymore, and as a symbol of that, we're going to take the thing down. I'm sure the people in West Michigan were like, that sounds like a great idea. But if it was only about deconstruction, none of you would be here. That's why apocalypso is such an interesting word about death and renewal. Death and renewal. What passes away and what new is being born in the world. And I think what is needed, I'm not saying you're the most important thing in America. I'm just saying, but what's needed are, I think, communities of people who themselves are willing to do a little bit of their own removal of planks to do their work, but then also to wonder about what might right action look like again in the world, because we've gone astray, and we don't want to get stuck in a culture of narcissism and nihilism for the sake of our kids and grandkids. I don't know. So I find this place a kind of inspiring community, but let's not kid ourselves that we too can be blind. Me, number one. And I think if we're going to proceed in a culture that's so dualistic and so divisive and so divided, we're going to have to be willing to say, what am I not seeing? And to walk forward, I think, with some increased humility, so that we can begin to remove the specks of dust that are blinding our brothers and sisters. Am I making sense? So, I wanted to end, I think, with a poem. In light of some things that were said this week, and in light of this dualistic, binary, and judgmental, and angry world that we live in, I'd like to remind you of a poem. And this poem actually is on a giant brass woman That actually my dad, as an immigrant who came over at 14 with everything he had in a trunk, landed on Ellis Island, where you can see this woman who's holding a poem. Poetry saves. But let me read to you what's on it. Not like the brazen giant of Greek fame, not like the brazen giant of Greek fame with conquering limbs. So not like the brazen Greek giant of fame with conquering limbs, astride from land to land. Here, at our sea-washed, sunset gates, shall stand a mighty woman with a torch. Here will stand a mighty woman with a torch, whose flame is the imprisoned lightning, and her name, Mother of Exiles. From her beacon hand glows worldwide welcome. From her beacon hand glows worldwide welcome. Her mild eyes command the air-bridged harbor that twin cities frame. And then there's a quote. Keep, ancient lands, your storied pomp, cries she with silent lips. Give me, you're tired, you're poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free. The wretched refuse of your teeming shore. Send these, the homeless, the shitholes. Send these, the homeless, tempest-tossed to me. I lift my lamp beside the golden door. Thanks for listening.